So thank you, of course, for accepting our invitation, and I hope this is an opportunity for bringing into the discussion different experiences in science communication education. So in this first round, I wish to listen from your experiences, of course, in training the researchers based on your institution. Gian-Andri, can we start from you, like introducing yourself and your institution and telling us about what's going on there?
My name is Gian-Andri. I'm head of communication of ETH Board. ETH Board is the strategic board of the ETH domain. We have two universities in our domain. The most famous is ETH Zurich, and the second one is EPFL in Lausanne, two technical universities. And we have four research institutes about environment and physics. So this is what we call ETH domain, paid by government, Swiss government. Other universities are more on a cantonal level, paid by the region, by the canton. So what I did in the past, a lot of science communication trainings. First I was in Science and Society Foundation, funded by Swiss government to promote the dialogue between science and society. So I started there doing festivals, all this stuff, and in science communication, and I trained then as head of communication of a university researchers, especially scientists, but also PhDs, and yeah, especially PhDs. Now I'm more on a strategic level, and I will talk later on a bit more about the strategy, how to deal with the also new media, what do we do with our researchers to communicate science to public.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Godinho. I'm the head of Education, Communications and Outreach at CERN. CERN is the European Particle Physics Laboratory based in Geneva. It is an international organization made up of 23 member states, but it is first and foremost a research laboratory for fundamental research. I would argue that the research that is carried out at CERN is the most fundamental of all fundamental research, because the research interests at CERN are around identifying and understanding the fundamental particles that make up the universe, that make up everything around us, what we see and what we don't see. We carry out this research, so we look for the tiniest constituents of the universe using the largest instruments, the largest machines to do this research. And I'm going to come back to this in the second half, which is why I want to leave this message. We function as a research infrastructure in a way for a community of 17,000 physicists from all around the world that come to CERN to use the machines, the largest of which and the most famous of which is that Large Hadron Collider that I'm sure everyone has heard of, where the Higgs boson was discovered in 2012. Training, right? So at CERN we carry out the usual media training for our researchers, for junior researchers, and then also for senior staff and at management level. So this is the conventional media training done by consultants that Brian was mentioning. We also train our guides. So CERN is open to the public 6 days a week. We have every year over 130,000 visitors come to CERN. Many of them are schools and universities, mostly schools, from all over the world. And these are guided tours. The guides are CERN physicists, engineers, members of the administrative staff that voluntarily give of their time to do these guided tours. So they have the basic training, safety training is very important at CERN. We've recently started giving them communications training, which is the basic communication skills, so skill-based training, the use of body language, the use of storytelling as well in communication and improv techniques, but also trying to, in a more discursive way, help them to see their role within the wider context of why these visits happen at CERN. What is the organization's goal in organizing these visits, and what their role is in these visits. Then when it comes to social media, we don't have a structured training as such, but we have recently started a very informal training where we use social media influencers, science influencers, to be the informal trainers for our researchers. So the social media team organizes coffees. Everything happens over coffee in in the cafeteria, in the restaurants at CERN. We invite influencers, so social media influencers, YouTubers and on Twitter, to visit CERN, where they can then do their work, but there is the opportunity to then talk to the researchers, and this is we're finding it very effective as a community building and as a support for the researchers that want to go on social media. Stop there.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Chiara Saviane, and I'm actually part of the Media Relations and Communications Office at SISSA, which is a school for postgraduate training and research in physics, mathematics, and neuroscience based in Trieste. But within the school, we also have one of the oldest master's courses in science communication that was born more than 25 years ago. That actually started as a few days a week, a few days a month originally. It has been evolving over these 25 years. Now it's basically a full-time courses, which is aimed at postgraduate students, so anybody from any kind of background with a degree can be selected and become part of our students. And the idea is that the master's is not really a master's degree, but it's a professional course, and offers a training which is basically both at the cultural level, with the topics that covers the theory of science communication, the relationship between science and society, but also offers some instruments that look at science communication in a very broad way. So from science journalism to publishing, to developing exhibition, multimedia production, and so on. But we, since more than 10 years, more or less, through the ESCONET project that Brian mentioned before, we also have been developing some training courses for scientists, which actually we don't really organize within our institution, but rather through European projects, such as the Innovative Training Networks, the ITN, for example, where we have been organizing different kind of modules, as well as we have been working with health operators or people working in environmental agencies who are asking for different kind of training. So basically, we have been developing modules that goes from dealing with the media, but also preparing, organizing events, but also more related to the academic life, such as writing science paper, giving presentation, going to job interviews, which are all opportunities anyway to touch on some issues that are important in science communication in general.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful presentation this morning, and it's an honor to be on the panel. I think I represent both a very small research institute. I'm the Director of Communications for a place called the International Research Institute for Climate and Society, which is part of a very large research university, Columbia University in New York. And so the IRI, as we're called, is about 50 research scientists total. So with respect to my role there, I'm sort of have been kind of a one-stop shop for communications. I often do one-on-one training with the different scientists with whom I work. Sometimes we have special seminars that are targeted for certain kinds of communication, social media being one, but also one that I consider very important and more useful nowadays, it seems, is helping scientists do better on camera interviews. Because oftentimes reporters of today, they come with an audio recorder, a camera, and a phone for tweeting, and so scientists have to sort of be prepared for talking about their work in different formats in media at once. And being part of the larger university, I also help organize training sessions that the Earth Institute and Columbia University as a whole puts together, primarily on helping, for example, just most recently helping scientists write opinion pieces for broadcast outlets or media outlets, and as well as how to conduct yourself on a phone interview, for example. So it's very, at once, very one-on-one, and also trying to be a part and trying to start a larger network of research scientists who are interested in communications and getting them kind of on the same page and sharing best practices, and also encouraging them to share with their tribe, you know, other research scientists, because the message is important, but the messengers are also important. So having other scientists communicate and share their practices with their colleagues, we find is very effective at inspiring and incentivizing the rest of them.
Thank you. My name's Rebecca Asher. I'm the Deputy Director of Sense About Science, which is a campaigning charity that champions science and evidence in public debate, in the public interest. We are based in the UK and also have an office in Dublin and work with institutions across the EU as well. Just as a bit of background, we were set up as an organisation in the early 2000s. This was at a time when there was lots of debate around GM foods, around the MMR vaccine, around whether foam masks give you cancer. Lots of discussions about science without actually that much scientific information as part of the debate. So we were set up in order to try and inject that information really into the debate, to mobilise scientists to get out there and talk about the evidence on the issue, and then people can make their own minds off the back of that, but at least that information is getting out into the public forum to begin with. To start with, we worked mainly with scientists, encouraging them to take part in these debates about science. Increasingly, we also work with the public and with politicians and policymakers too. Just to give you a sort of brief idea of the sort of activities we get up to, we work with research institutions on the research that they're carrying out and about the communication of that research. So we enter into public engagement partnerships with them, where we will work with them to think about the framing, the language when they're talking about the research that they want to put out, how they can sort of talk about it in a way that engages people, connects with people, gets them interested, and so on. And we bring together members of the public and researchers to work through that together through workshops. We also run a scheme called the Voice of Young Science, which essentially equips and encourages young researchers or early career researchers to get out there and take part in debates about science, public debates about science, and I can talk a little bit about that in more detail, because that's our sort of training element, if you like. We also run a campaign called Evidence Matters, which is directed at politicians and policymakers to encourage them to have regard for evidence in making policy decisions. We would always say, you know, we're realists. Politicians and policymakers are never going to be entirely 100% driven by the evidence. You know, there's going to be political, financial reality of any situation. There's also going to be the sort of ethos of their particular political party and all the rest of it. But we would like evidence to be sort of part of the jigsaw when they're making decisions. So we run events in Parliament to bring researchers and politicians together to talk about the evidence on sort of particularly thorny or prominent issues. We run a campaign called All Trials with Dr. Ben Goldacre at Oxford University, which campaigns for all clinical trials to be published, not just the ones that people would like to see, that pharmaceutical companies would like to see the light of day. And with the public, we run the Ask for Evidence campaign, which encourages people really to ask for evidence about claims that they come across online, out of the mouths of celebrities, on the side of buses, wherever. And we also run with Nature the John Maddox Prize for Standing Up for Science, which each year is awarded to a scientist who has got out there and talked about their research in the face of hostility. So, you know, whether they're a researcher on climate change or vaccinations or false memory syndrome or whatever, you know, those are the sorts of award winners that we've had in the past. I was going to talk a bit about, I've talked a lot already, so I'll weave in the other stuff later. Okay.
But I think that you raised one interesting point, which is the policymakers.
Yeah.
And this is something that also Gian-Andri pointed out before. So what is your experience with policymakers in this case? And
yeah.
training?
For us, it's very important. Politicians, of course, they give us the money. It's taxpayers' money, but they organize it, and they have other topics that, like the farmers who are always interested in get more money, and so it's one of our work is to explain how important science and education is for Switzerland. We don't have earth resources like other countries, so for us it's really important. And of course we have this classical stuff in science communication. We do a lot of events also, open doors, anniversaries regularly for the large public, also for some events only for politicians, and this is an opportunity for us to train our scientists. So we have a lot of trainings, and we feel which scientists are good in communication, who has good ideas. And we have a consulting office inside our communication. The scientists can call us, and we explain the formats, the difference that exists, that you could do, and we see how interested they are in doing what. So we have different formats of dialogue. What now it's starting, and which is more also our strategy, is events we're doing especially for politicians in a morning about a topic, and we train these scientists. So we choose those who are really good in communicating. And what is also a big issue to get to the politicians is for us Twitter. Twitter is in Switzerland. I mean, Twitter is not in every country the same. In Switzerland, you have politicians on it, scientists, opinion leaders, and journalists. So journalists and politicians are main target public. That's why we push Twitter. And we have a lot of Twitter workshops going on with the goal to let them go out there to discuss with opinion leaders, politicians, and journalists, to do like a sort of a self-marketing for them, but of course also of the institution. And what is important now, we realize we let them go, and I think the future is the communication is less top-down by press releases, and then it's in a journal, and we should explain a science journalist how to write something. There are no many science journalists left in Switzerland. It's a small country with 3 regions, language regions. So for us it's important to have a direct way also to journalists, and to train our scientists to do their communication. So it's like Donald Trump, he communicates by Twitter directly often. He does not need a press release to give his opinion. But what is now going on, it's not a discussion on Twitter to large public only, or to politicians, because larger public is not on Twitter. So it's a discussion with politicians and with journalists. We started 2 years ago, and one of our climate change, a climate researcher was not on Twitter, and after 2 years he's very famous because he started to discuss with politicians. He discussed with journalists, for example, from the far right wing, media, and also parties, and he became famous, and he gets invented on television now. He's in every news journal. When it comes to climate change, first journalist think of is to invite our Professor Knuti and to ask him what he's thinking about. So it was a self-marketing, and for us it was useful. But that means also, we had this social media guidelines, and I said, no, we don't have social media guidelines. Of course we had once, but nobody reads it. I think it's nowadays not useful anymore to have social media guidelines because we have to let them go. And of course, those who are in the training, it's voluntarily, so they are motivated, and often they stop if they see they are not talented in doing it or not motivated. So we need those who are motivated and doing it well, but those, we let them go. We just do a sort of a monitoring. We don't tell them, don't write something bad about our institution. I mean, he or she is free then, because she or he is always a professor of our institution. She should act in public always as a professor of our institution, so there's no frontiers for social media.
I think the word marketing and commercialization is starting to come out quite often today, which is quite striking. But I have a question for Anna too, which is, I know that at CERN you are building a new space for science education and outreach, which is by Renzo Piano. So how do you train your scientists towards this activity? I'm asking also because, as also Brian Trench mentioned, Ca' Foscari is also building a special place for science outreach, science gallery.
So so CERN is preparing a new center for education and outreach. It's called Science Gateway. It will be ready at the end of 2022. Yes, it will be a building by Renzo Piano, which is we're very proud of that. It's important also to say that this is the building and the center itself is totally funded outside of the CERN budget. So all the funds for the building have been fundraised through private and foundation sponsorship or donations. So it's in 2022 that it will be ready. We're preparing for it. It will have an exhibition area, a very large exhibition area, labs, laboratories for where we plan to extend our current education offer. And it will also be the reception where the guided tours that we currently offer will start from. So we will have to expand our training that we currently do. So I mentioned the training that we do for the guides. We will then, in the new exhibition areas, also have facilitators and moderators for the exhibition and for the activities, the hands-on activities that we're going to be developing. So we will be developing training as well. First, we need to have the exhibitions there, the exhibits there, and then we will develop training in that regard. Yes. So we have. I think Brian and several people have mentioned that the cultural component of science and science communication, and within the field we're more and more drawing on other areas and other fields of culture to communicate the research. And at CERN as well, we have the Arts at CERN program at CERN, which is a residency program for artists. It's different from many other arts and science programs in that the Arts at CERN program is not. It's not used as a tool for communicating science. It really is a space. The goal is to create a space where artists can come and develop their ideas in interaction with the physicists, with the researchers at CERN. So through that interaction, there is also a little bit of science communication training, because obviously the scientists need to be able to explain their research to the artists. But it is very free. We don't prepare them. We let the interaction flow a little bit like you do with Twitter. And art will be a major component of Science Gateway as well. So there is one of the exhibition areas we're planning to actually use art to convey the questions that are still open for the future. There'll be an area on what we know currently, but the many questions for which we don't have answers, and art will be used for that area. Does that answer your question?
Next year, in July 2020. So how do you think this event, and actually our event of today is endorsed by ProESOF, so we are sort of on the way to it. So how do you think ESOF will impact the science communication in general and in Trieste, and how do you, if there is any relation with your students or trainers?
Yeah. Yes, as Alessandra was saying, next year Trieste will host the Euroscience Open Forum, which is the largest pan-European meeting on science, which will bring together scientists, business people, journalists, and citizens to discuss about many different topics. We are very proud we got this possibility to host this big event. It will take place between the 5th and the 9th of July. And it will be accompanied by a very long Science in the City festival, which will start on the 27th of June and will end on the 11th of July. So, of course, it's a great opportunity for Trieste, who that hosts many scientific institutions, which are all involved in this preparation. And we have also started these pro-ESOF activities, which basically are a set of activities that are really leading, guiding the path towards the event itself in order to raise awareness among the different stakeholders and in particular among the citizens as well of the fact that ESOF will take place. With respect to training, this is a good opportunity for us as well, because the idea is that we will kind of offer some training to scientists, which will be organizing events within ESOF. So the fact that they are part of a project probably can motivate them more to take part in these training courses, since the time issue is always a problem for them. So the project is to develop these kind of very short courses that can give them some more tools anyway to prepare and organize these activities. So if you're interested, the call for the ESOF itself is closed, but there is still time to be part of the festival. If any of you wants, there is still time to apply. And anyway, yeah, I guess it's a great opportunity for all if you want to visit Trieste next year.
I come back to you, Francesco, because you addressed the issue of climate change. And I think that climate change and environment are sort of need an interdisciplinary approach, which was something that interdisciplinary aspect came out also in this previous session. So can you say something about the interdisciplinary aspect when in training, for example?
Yes, so I think, well, one thing that's a little bit, it's exciting but a little too early to see if it's going to be effective or not, is that the new director of the Earth Institute, Alex Halliday, last month started a new initiative at, within Columbia, and it was the Initiative on Climate Change Communication. And I think he realized, as many of us do, that our university has this very powerful and perhaps, at least in the US, unmatched collection of climate-related research and thinking, not only on pure research like we do at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which looks at the fundamentals of climate science, but we also have a climate law center. We have a journalism school that has a science journalism, a strong science journalism program. We have public health and medicine, and even now the business school is starting to offer courses that are more on climate and sustainability and sort of decarbonization, as it were. And so, but there is a missing part of that, which is how to make communication of climate also interdisciplinary. So the Earth Institute, was sort of founded on this idea, right, that if you take people working on pure climate science and you match them up with economists and people that are interested in anthropology and sociology, that you might get some powerful interdisciplinary connections there and new research, or at least new ways of thinking. And so the same thing, that we can sort of apply that to the communication of climate change. And so we just started linking together all of the various schools and thinking about how, for example, Columbia has a very powerful business school in a very powerful center of business in the US, but there's very little being taught to these presumably future high-level business people that are going to graduate on what it means to be vulnerable to climate. How does climate impact supply chains? How does climate impact consumer choice? And so this initiative hopefully will strengthen that or get people thinking about that in a sort of deeper way. And then just one comment on what Anna was saying about the connection between climate or science and art. I had one experience where we invited a visiting artist to stay for 1 month in our institute. And what was really fascinating to me were two things. One is that the scientists and the artist at the time were each fascinated with the other's process of working. So it was less about what the result of she was painting, what the result was going to be like, or what the results of their science were going to be like, but more about how does an artist work or how does a scientist work. They were both like children, coming in and looking at labs. And I thought that was really wonderful because of the issue of breaking down sort of the cultural barrier. And the other thing is that a number of scientists said that the painter, in this case her name is Michelle Rogers, an Irish painter, said, the scientist said, interacting with Michelle, I think differently about my science because of the questions that an artist would ask a scientist or the way that she was trying to understand their research made them think differently about their research, which I thought was just beautiful and fascinating and important to not miss as a future focus.
You will be happy to know that Michelle Roger showed some of her pictures.
Oh,
of
the
her paintings.
Eco Venus, and
yeah,
that's
exactly.
wonderful. Yeah, she's amazing.
And Rebecca, you mentioned some publications that you as Sense About Science do regularly, and I was wondering if you can add something on the guidelines, of the kind of guidelines that you produce.
We do produce publications, but they tend to be public-facing publications. So for members of the public. Although I think interestingly, you can say publications are for members of the public, but actually that sort of in brackets they're for sort of policymakers and others too, because sometimes they could do with a sort of fairly, new readers start here type approach to guides on particular issues. So there are making sense of guides, so making sense of allergies, making sense of weather, making sense, I could go on, making sense of screening, all the rest of it. They have been a sort of stalwart of the Sense About Science output since we began, really. One thing I would say that in our public engagement work, hopefully, the scientists that we're working with are learning something along the way about how to communicate their research and the types of questions that members of the public have, and to start from those questions. That should sort of be your starting point. I would also say that we've learned something about how to communicate with people along the way too, and I think the sort of default for us in previous years would have been to labour over some sort of 30-page, sort of immaculately produced and researched guide with sort of a whole range of footnotes on all the rest of it on these particular topics. Whereas now, I think that we've learned a thing or two too about how you most effectively engage people and communicate with people, and to do a kind of layering of information, if you like. So something fairly shareable and headline as your sort of first, as your sort of calling card on the subject, if you like, and then you can kind of reel people in, and there'll be sort of further in detail underneath, or sort of further information on this particular issue, depending upon where their interests and level of engagement and the time they've got might lead them, really. So our publications do tend to be more public facing, really, rather than sort of publications for academics.
Brian, what is your answer? I mean, we are collecting different experiences. We have learned, we have heard different training, like we heard skills, we heard informal training, sharing practices, social media has just been mentioned. So How would you comment on all of these experiences?
With difficulty. Well, I think what's coming home from this, and probably this is not quite expected, certainly not expected by me, is just how diverse the offerings are. You know, from one-to-one mentoring, everything up and beyond and outside of that. I'm of course struck by Francesco's story about the impact of meeting an artist on a scientist, because it chimes with so many other things that we've been saying and other people are saying too, about how much scientists can learn from just putting themselves out there outside of their normal peer-to-peer communication. I'm interested, however, that despite this being about training, there's actually not that much conversation about the formats, the modes, the duration, the cost, etc. of training. And I wonder if that's because there's nothing interesting to say about this, or because actually the real activity is going on in less formal ways, or because people think it's already been covered. I'd just be interested to know about that. I mean, if you were to try and draw from this a map of training activity, you would do it with difficulty. That's why I'm not sure how to respond. But is it because people think it's already been covered, or because actually they do other things other than formal training?
Yeah, we do formal trainings, and we have all this stuff like these festivals and these open doors and all these trainings. But I was more interested in looking forward, what's changing, what's going on. That's why I'm at the focus on social media, and maybe I can give you an example later. Of course, we have every PhD student can have their communication training. It's up to 1 or 2 days. It's mandatory, and we have it for PhD students. It's the graduate schools that offers it. It's a sort of skills you can have in your graduate. And we have these trainings for professors. That is more by consultants. Consultancies, they come to us if they are interested, and we have all these events going on, like open doors, etc. And then every institute has to do something, so they have to treat it, and then they got trainings by our institution, also in how do you organize an exhibition, for example, or a sort of roundtable or mixed or theater, even if you're interested, etc. And you can also have an artist, for example, that collaborates with you, and we organizing it. And what's fascinating me more is the change we have in communication, because these formats are often for people that are, for example, when I speak from Zurich, for people from Zurich, and we also see, especially academics will come to events or museums or programs like this. So what we do now more is on social media, of course, to have a sort of direct training as direct dialogue, but also to have an impact then in media, and have a training of the scientists to communicate, and to get in touch with journalists, to have then media releases or media coverage about their topics, and by that they are trained, and they have their topics also in the media, so it's larger. And what we now, the strategy we have is do a lot of trainings, a lot of Twitter trainings, especially for the scientists, and not only that, but maybe in the future it will be trainings for students, trainings for PhDs in doing films, etc. I don't know, to do their communication, and we just give the tools, and we just give some content. We put it on a sort of a hub, and there you can get the content, but you do it by your own. But I think, because I think the future is, it will be done by maybe young people or by people from one political area or whatever, one community for their community, and we have hundreds and thousands of communities. So that's why I want to reach them and to put it out, and then it will be in their communities. So much less top down.
What do you if somebody comes in to be trained in Twitter, what do you do? What do you say to them? It's 140, no, it's 280 characters, and you can have video links, and you can have URL links and so on, and it has to be informal in language. How long does it take to train somebody in Twitter? Especially as you don't have, you said, and I was very struck by this, that you don't have any specific guidelines.
Yeah.
You let them go, which is like we try to do with our children.
Yeah.
Let them go. But, you know, so what do you, is it a morning? Is it over coffee?
Yeah,
or is it a full
it's
day?
a morning. It's about a morning. The rules, and it is important, of course you don't learn it, you learn it afterwards, doing it. And that was the best training. And then, of course, I said we do a monitoring. If someone is not very, very good, we contact him, maybe you should be aware that it can happen, goes like this, etc. But most of them were very well, quickly trained. They understood, okay, these journalists are answering, and we learned also a lot. He was disputing with a journalist, one of our, this famous researcher in climate change, and it was all over Switzerland. They talked about this, this not even discussion, between this journalist and the scientist, but it makes him well trained, and he was all over the journals afterwards, and now he's famous. So, and I know we cannot have it with 200 of our scientists. We need some. We will look that we can cover different sciences, different areas, etc., and then we push. But it's more a let go, yeah, and go when it does not work. But up to now, it works very well. It works very well.
Can I share two things related to Twitter training? So one is an example of where I thought social media training was very effective and an interesting model. I was invited to give a half-day training to early career researchers ahead of a conference on food security. I think it was called the International Conference on Food Security. It was held at Cornell. And the way that the organizers had set this up was that they had selected about 10 young scientists who were responsible for covering the conference that whole week on social media. And the Sunday before the conference started, they got training. So it was training and then trial by fire. And then there were a few of us, a few communicators sort of on hand, you know, in this sort of little control center. And people would come to us and say, what should I use as a hashtag here? Or should I, you know, put an @ here and there? And I thought it was very effective because you really, I mean, one of the issues with workshops and other trainings is that it happens, and then there's lack of follow-through often. So it's hard. It reminds me of, you know, going to a retirement planning session where somebody bombards you for 3 hours on all the choices you have to secure your financial future when you retire, and then you go back home and you say, oh well, you know, I'll just put money in my 401 and just hope that the stock market does well. But a funny story about trying to encourage scientists to on Twitter is I work with a senior research scientist who's also a good friend of mine, and he said, I want to be on Twitter. So I said, great. So I helped him set up an account. And then for about 3 months, every time he wanted to write a tweet or respond to a tweet, he would come to my office with his computer, and we would sit there and had some weird peer review form of a tweet where he would write, and he said, no, this word is not right. And I said, you know, I think you're missing the point of Twitter. But he would sit there and he said, look, I'm a scientist. Everything I do, everything I write is not just alone. It's with peers, and we go over everything. So he was holding on to that model. And I said, you have to be yourself, and you have a fun personality. Let that show.
But he was being himself.
Right.
Yeah.
But he also has this other side that I think would be very effective on Twitter, because he's funny, but he's, you know, highly intelligent, obviously. And so it was hard. I had to wean him off coming to my office. I said, no, you have to do this one on your own. And he was, you know, anyway, so.
May I? Oh. I just want to share some of our experience at CERN to do with not only Twitter but social media in general. So we do have social media guidelines, so it's not a policy as such, but we have guidelines that are available on the website and that we share whenever, for example, any of the researchers at CERN from one of the experiments or the institutes associated to CERN come and say that they would like to set up their own social media account, but as a person of CERN, or a project social media account, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And then we have a discussion with them, or the social media team has a discussion with them around trying to understand why they want to set up this account. Are there other accounts that already exist that they can contribute to, so there's not a proliferation of accounts, what the goal is, who they want to reach. So it's really just thinking strategically on why they want to go on social media. And then also the how it can explode, so the need to manage an account, to respond. It's not just posting, but if there are questions, it needs to be replied, it needs to be kept alive. Also how to evaluate it, so measuring impact, whether it be the normal metrics that any social media measuring software will give you, or further evaluation. So we have this conversation with them. And to be honest, it's also a way to make it easier for us to know who wants to be on social media, and so that we know what's happening, not wanting to control, but it's important for us, obviously, that we're aware of who is talking about CERN. And I did want to say something else and I've forgotten, but it'll come back to me.
Sorry, Anna, can I just ask, when you talk through all that, do people often say, oh, actually, forget it, it sounds too much like hard work, I'd rather just get back to or is it, are you able to encourage them?
No, well, to be honest, I can't give you an exact answer because I'm not always involved in those conversations, so I can't tell you the proportion. But I think it's a mix. Some people take that on board and then run with it, and others decide not to. I've remembered what I wanted to say. Can I? Sorry. This is not so much for training. Still social media related. Not so much for training, but important for us as science communicators at organizations is the usefulness of being in the back office of social media. So at CERN we have a Twitter group, a scientists Twitter group, and these are physicists that are part of this group with the communications team, with the social media team. And it's like a forum where we discuss different issues. When we in communications, we have a question, the journalist will come to us with a question, or a question that arises about CERN on other social media platforms. We will reach out to this group, and they will then reply to the question. So it's also it's a good resource to have. And again, it's also a way of building this community. So there's a lot that can be done that researchers can do that's not giving a talk or being in front of a public. There's so much background communication that researchers can do as well.
Somehow social media is, well, first of all, social media is one of the things that we investigate also in Quest, and there is a unit at Kafosky that investigates this topic. But I'm wondering if social media somehow is the present for sure, and how much is it in the future, or what is in the future of training on science communication?
I learned a lot this spring in Germany. In Germany there was a rapper called Riza who did a video against the Christ Democrats from Angela Merkel just before the elections. He criticized it, and he was very strong. It was just a video made at his home. He had about 15 million views. And afterwards it was in all media, it was discussed, and another 20 influencers on YouTube did also video against the Christ Democrats, and said you have to vote for the Greens. And then were the elections, and the Christ Democrats went down strongly and the Greens went up, and the discussions were, how could that happen, that this guy by internet influences this, and he was criticized by the party leader, this rapper, and it was a shitstorm then against her, against Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the new party leader of the Christ Democrats. And that, what I learned also there, the party could not answer to that. Like we institutions, we do our stuff, we do our top-down communication, but in fact I think the future will be that people like him will do their stuff. So that's why we really start to change, to do our classical communication. It will not disappear, of course, but also to train and to think of how could we train our people, also our students, our alumni in the future, they are alumni, to know, to have content from us, to refer to us, to have content from us, and to be our ambassadors. So it's a sort of an ambassador training. And I think this will be the future, if it's by social media, if it's filmed, I don't know. So that's what I think we should do, is connect them now to us, give them the tools, give them the freedom, let them go, but do a sort of a monitoring and to know where does happen what, etc., and to get in touch also. So without our social media trainings, what we do now, we also have every month a webinar. I will install it, I don't have it yet. I will install a webinar with learnings. You can come, if you have a Twitter account, you can come and we give some learnings, the best tweets we had, maybe from EPFL, from ETH, the best tweet, and the professor explained, yeah, that was my idea, etc., learn from each other. And it's also to give the mentality, go out there, we think it's good when you communicate. And of course we want, they don't have to do it. I don't need the laboratory nerd who is not really interested in communication. That's why it's voluntarily done, yeah.
So also the role and the figure of the communication officer is changing.
Yes.
So can you, I mean, here we have a lot of communication officers. Can you add something on this?
I think we really should do a sort of strategy in how to enhance people, our scientists, to train them to be to communicate on their own, because I think it will be less top-down in the future, and we should think more in hubs, in information hubs, to get the information from everywhere, because it is everywhere. Collect it here and say them, you can take it, it's open, it's for free. Also to journalists, they could take our articles, take it.
Anna, any indications on the futures? Careers?
So I agree with Jan. I think the situation is changing, and there's more and more emphasis on what's called user-generated content, so that we provide the tools and the context, and then allow our researchers to do it. I think that will be a change.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised of all this training you do on social media, because actually we have been explaining a couple of weeks ago to one of our professor in SISSA what an hashtag was, because she had to open an account because the conference was being hosted in SISSA, and she really wanted to be in, she had to learn like in half an hour what an hashtag was and do everything. So there are few scientists which are on social medias, but I have to say we are still struggling with our own scientists to involve them in science communication. Even when there is a chance to go on TV or to get an interview, they are always very busy. They have a lot of, they are, a lot of conference to go to, or many other issues. They don't see still why that is important. So I think there is still a problem of recognition of the value of science communication on one side, even though it's true at the level of the European Commission now you are really encouraged to do that. And I see that younger scientists, PhD students, they're all very happy to take part in activities because they can write it down in their proposals for a Marie Curie or whatever. So this is a good way to motivate them. But there is a limited recognition of the value, and also as science communicators, as science officers within the institution, I think there is also limited recognition of what we can give to them. So we have professors that assume they can teach their students how to deal with these issues. So with the senior scientists, I think we have a big problem. And the idea is that we are trying to stress more the importance of science communication in other issues, so like in the management skills, for example, how that can be important when you have to recruit students, how it can be important when you have to find fundings as well. So the idea that science communication is not just about transferring knowledge, but it's also important in other aspects of their own careers and life, as well as, of course, maybe becoming part of the debates which are happening within society. So focus on other points. This is what we are planning to do. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I suppose the first thing that I'd say is I do think it's important to sort of step back and ask the more fundamental questions that Brian referenced earlier today about you know, rather than getting bogged down in the sort of mechanics of the particular communication channel that you have chosen, but to sort of step back and, you know, ask yourself as an institution, as a person, you know, why you're doing it, who do you want to reach, what's the conversation that you want to have, what are the questions that you want to be answering, you know, what are the questions that are out there that you as a scientist should be answering, and to kind of be prepared to kind of ask those hard, difficult questions of yourself, and to have that sort of perspective shift, if you like. And when I think of the training that we do, and you know, I'm sure that there's other training that other people do that has these sorts of hallmarks. I think the things that I hope make it successful are partly that you know, sort of starting from that perspective shift and talking about the sort of your responsibility as a scientist to communicate, and also the benefits, yes, to you and to your career, your institution, your funding, and so on of doing it, but also the sort of wider social benefits as well. And to also reference something that Brian said earlier, I think, you know, if you sort of start with scientists at the early PhD or early career stage, you know, sort of you're shaping the socialization of the scientist and their expectations of their role and what their job is actually going to be comprised of that is really important. And I think it's also important for those early career researchers to actually hear from people who have done it, who have got out there, have taken part in debates, have maybe been in the firing line but kind of come through the other side and learned something along the way. And you know, it can be dangerous, it can be frightening, but it can also actually be really empowering and socially useful as well. So you know, I think to sort of hear those reflections is important. And then the final thing I would say is that in a way I sort of feel like training, you know, that sort of day's training or whatever you do is only the start of it. Actually, it's really about the connections that you make on that day, the insights that you make, that you have on that day that inform your work for the future, the network that you build up, and that sort of support mechanism, and sort of sharing successes and failures and learning from those and all the rest of it. That's the training's kind of just the kickstart. It's the next sort of 30 years that's actually the proper work of it.
Yeah, so everything you said, Rebecca, spot on, and I wanted to, you know, a couple years ago, a professor at the journalism school at Columbia emailed me and said, you know, a couple times a week, I get a scientist or a PhD student in research or science or an undergrad email and say, can I take your class on science journalism? And the issue is that the journalism school's classes on science journalism are to make science journalists. And so they're not very targeted, nor is the journalism school interested in training scientists to be better at communicating their work. And so I've tried over the last few years to try to, department by department, to go in and say, hey, we really need a science writing for scientists class at a graduate level. And the answer I always get is, well, we'd have to find the money. Who's going to support the class? And so, I haven't succeeded yet. And hopefully the Earth Institute, this new initiative on climate communication, will form a few of these. So I think, the point about really making it easy for PhD students early, sort of the earliest stages of their science career, to learn the best practices, to be inspired to communicate, to be exposed to people 10 years ahead of them in their career who are interested in communicating and who are successful at it. The other thing is regarding workshops and trainings, I mentioned this yesterday, but a lot of these workshops, there are two groups of people: communications officers that attend, and then very early career scientists. Senior staff are very rare spottings in these rooms, and so I think getting more buy-in from leadership and saying, like, this is not just 3 hours that you can go to, but that you should go to, and especially getting some of the more senior researchers in there, because that sends a message to the younger researchers saying this is an important endeavor, and by me as a senior researcher being in this room, I'm sending that signal that it's not frivolous, and it's also a good way, again, to share lessons learned in your peer group, right? So it's easy for me to say, talk to a scientist about the importance of science communication. It's my job. I mean, if I don't say that science communication is important, it's weird. But it's another thing for a research scientist to say, here's the benefits that I get from communicating my work, or communicating the work of my group or my university.
From
Yes, it's working. But I have a question about the landscape of future that some of you have imagining. Because I'm Vincenzo Napolano from the communication office of the National Institute for Nuclear Physics in Italy. So I'm usual also to deal with communication inside an institution. And what already happens to us in the past is this, all this pressure on social media and direct communication of scientists to the public through social media or through blogs or other tools sometimes can also provoke a crisis situation. I will do a very short example. In a field as particle physics that usually is not such a sensible field, I imagine that in other fields like medicine or I don't know, the science of earthquake, that are much more sensible, this kind of situation will become in the future more and more frequent. We will have a very difficult crisis when at a certain point an experiment supposed to discover that neutrinos were yes, the speed of neutrinos was higher than the one of the light, you know. And at that time there was a big discussion inside the group if communicate or not this such supposed discovery. And at the end, CERN itself decided to communicate this result because there was such a high pressure of scientists that want to communicate it on their blogs, on their personal blogs, on social media. And we are speaking on perhaps, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. So social media are not so much developed as now. That at the end, CERN decided, with INFN, we decided, because it was a shared experiment, to communicate that result. And then, after a few months, the group, yes, they continued with the experiment. At the end, the result was false. It was not correct. the speed of neutrino is not higher than the one of the light. I'm not saying that that was a bad choice or this was bad for science communication. I'm just saying that yes, there is also a dark side, I don't know how to say, from an institutional point of view, but not just of institution, but also of scientific community and of a communication of the complexity of the process. Because as Brian said before, the process of science is something that we want to communicate, but it's something also very complex and has a completely different speed at a completely different velocity compared with the one of media communication and of public communication. So I think that it's not just, for sure, I share your idea that the future will be something like that, but it will be not so easy to manage, perhaps.
Just, so thank you, Vincenzo, for bringing that up, because I think it touches on an important point, which is the communication of the process of science, and not only the process, the communication between a scientist and an artist when they meet and share the different process, but the long-term process of science. And I think that's important, and we try to do that, to build that into to training the scientists, that it's not only about communicating when you have a result. It can be communicating a result and then having to communicate, actually, this result is wrong and why. And then that's an intrinsic part of science. It was a discussion within the scientific community. The result turned out to be incorrect. It was then correct, so this communication. Then there's all the media spill out to deal with, and that's why it's important to have the communications office professionals to do that. But the process of science is very important to communicate and to train our scientists in doing that. Namely, and again in the field of particle physics, and Vincenzo, you will know this. Earlier I mentioned that the Higgs boson was discovered in 2012, and that was a huge discovery for the field of particle physics. It was the missing piece in the puzzle, the standard model that describes the main particles that make up the universe. We are now in 2019, and there hasn't been another equally a discovery of that size. And CERN and the European particle physics community is preparing for a plan for the next 10, 20, 30 years of the research field that will involve a new machine, so a new equipment to replace the LHC, and a strong investment. This is also part of the process of science. And it's important to communicate, and that researchers are trained in communicating what underpins this process of science. So it's not only the big stories that are out, but actually this long term, and it's one step forward and two steps back. And they know that, and it's important that they're taught or trained to communicate about that too.
Maybe I can add something from my point of view. I had a lot of discussions because everybody was afraid also a bit of Twitter and social media, because you will have shitstorms and all that. It's terrible. But I think it changed. So what I think we should enable them. We cannot go back. That's why I think we should enable them. And what I see, of course, from time to time you have a shitstorm, but you also have very good communication, and you can have also a shitstorm by a classical communication. And in the end, if it comes to an institution problem, I don't know, sponsoring contracts of the university or things like that, then we do our classical corporate communication. But professors, in fact, when I enable them to be on Twitter, to be on social media, they could criticize even us, but they could do it in an interview in the newspaper also. So I'm not so frightened of that. Of course, we have pressure because we have a lot more communication than we had 10 years ago, because everybody is now able to communicate and to have a channel. It's not only newspapers and a broadcast. So that's why I think we should not be frightened of that. We have to take some cuts from time to time, but in the end, enabling them, learning from them, monitoring and enabling, we will gain much more.
Chiara Pesenti, Politecnico di Milano e in Italian University. First of all, thank you very much for your very interesting discussion. And I have a question for Gian-Andri, and the question is, I have been impressed by the choice of the social media for your project of advocacy and training on social media, because Twitter, in my opinion, is the most difficult. I mean, for the maximum characters and also, and so I thought when you were speaking that it was for the target, and you also say that you choose some events for journalists and politicians. So the question is, which kind of journalists and which kind of institutions and politicians, and why? And it is for this reason that you have chosen this social media project of advocacy for the target.
Yes, I've chosen Twitter because in Switzerland politicians are on it, journalists and opinion leaders, and I want to go through them. Facebook is not really strong anymore. It's coming down, and it's more larger public. This would be another concept. This would be discussion directly with the public. But I have a sort of intermediate communication by journalists, to be in the minds of the journalists, to be then in the newspaper later on. So sort of a self-branding of the scientists. Instagram is only photos, and it's difficult. I think I think Twitter is for us really the best. When it comes to, is it difficult? I don't think, because you can always do links, you have discussion, and our professors, they do links also to their papers. So this climate change professor, of course, he had some easy sentence, but he refers always to his studies, and he knows in climate change, communication projects, so you can put a link to a sort of a communication website, whatever. But the fact that he's discussing with politicians, with journalists, gives him visibility, and he's credible what he's doing. And of course it's hard. He has hard fights to journalists from the far right or to politicians from the far right, but now he's very well trained, so I'm very happy. He's stable, he knows that can come. You can have a shitstorm from the far right, but in the end 80% or 90% of the people on Twitter are on his side, so he has a lot of likes, he's very famous, and for me it works as a tool.
Another question for Gian, because it's such an interesting subject, this social media thing on Twitter. I was just curious, is it evaluated by management, and is it going to started to be evaluated by management or by the board then, that your researchers are active on social media?
That's a good question. I'm very lucky because one of my presidents of the two schools is very active on Twitter. And when I started my strategy, I invited a social media strategist. And this social media strategist gave me input from outside, because I'm in my soup of science communication, so I need to have inputs from a digital strategist. And he's now head of communication of one of the schools, so I have it in-house. But we are also monitoring the whole thing, and from time to time I explain my board what we are doing. I give you an example. We had financial cuttings from the government, so we got less money, and we did a press release, classical way, that we don't agree to have less money than the year before. Of course, that's not very impressive. What I did then is a tweet with a link to my press release, and I informed 25 professors who are the most influencing professor. I measured them, the most influencing professors on Twitter, and told them, can you please retweet it? And to the schools and institutions, I say, do with your short picture with your boss saying, I don't agree with the cut. What happens? I had a lot of retweets. I had hundreds of thousands of views of that because of the power of the whole domain, because of the power of all them. And what happens also, for example, in the French part of Switzerland, professors did it also in French. What meant the journalists had it the whole day in their timeline because they follow our professions and professors and institutions. And they asked then for an interview, for example, Professor A and Professor B. So not only my bosses or I was with my boss, but also they were in the media. And what I explained then, my board, you see also in your classical media, what you know, we have much more articles. So it was not only on Twitter a discussion where you don't follow, but we had a lot of articles in all the journals afterwards. And I showed them this, so they let me do my work.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Wonderful case, and I think it's quite interesting for the science communication developments that, you know, some kind of evaluation needs to be institutionalized within the institutions, because as we know, the publish or perish thing is very dominant, and maybe, of course, publishing is very important, and that's the basis of everything. But on the other hand, we're wrestling with the internal valuation, and I think it's very inspiring. But it doesn't take you that much time to get involved into society. So thank you. It's very inspiring.
Hi, thank you for this inspiring conversation. I'm Agatha, University of Trieste, and again another question for Gian. Sorry for this. Because you were explaining very well why you chose Twitter, and it's clear to me, and also why you didn't choose Facebook and Instagram. But I'm wondering, what about LinkedIn? I mean, yes, I mean, I know exactly that these are two completely different tools and completely different social medias, but still, yes, why not? Thank you.
It is on my list. It's just, I started with Twitter, but of course you're right. LinkedIn is the future. We have everybody who studied in one of our universities has the logo ETH Zurich or EPFL, so we should use it in a way. But I don't have yet a strategy. But it's the next step will be to do LinkedIn. They should be our ambassadors. That's why I'm looking for new ambassador networks, and LinkedIn will be the next, because as you said, that's perfect. It's perfect. Business network.
Hi everybody, I'm Margot Bezzi from the agency from the promotion for the promotion of the European research, Italy, and I have a question for the whole panel. Actually, there is a keyword that I have not heard so much so far, and which is misinformation or disinformation. And we all know that this is part, Riza, of the changing media landscape. This is something that depends on something outside our practice. And so in the first place, I wanted to know from you if you consider this as an important concern, or if instead it should be kept apart because it's more important to focus on a good practice. But if you consider that this has to be taken care of, which are the types of strategies or attentions yes, that one shall focus on? For example, I guess, from my point of view, focusing on the process, on explaining the process, which means also making science literacy, is one part of addressing the challenge of spreading misinformation or bad quality user-generated content. Or yes, I wanted to know which are your opinion about that.
So, I hope I understood what you meant by misinformation. So CERN throughout the years, and especially since the start of the LHC, there is a lot of misinformation about the lab, about the LHC, about what we can do. The strategy over the years with the communications team, and even before I arose, was to not engage with every incident or every case of misinformation, but we monitor carefully. And then, when necessary, when it reaches a certain threshold, that is when we'll engage. And the classic example that we use, and this was before my time, actually, Vincenzo, you might know more details, was when the film Angels and Demons came out. Actually, when the book was published, and then the film was made. So if you've read the book or watched the film, the first scene takes place at CERN, and there is so the story is about the creation of an antimatter bomb that is going to destroy the world, and the antimatter is stolen from CERN. And we do produce antimatter at CERN, but in tiny amounts. It would be absolutely impossible to produce the amounts that are portrayed in the book and in the film. And at the time, the communications team, they invited, I've forgotten the name of the author. Dan Brown. They invited Dan Brown, and then they also invited the actors of the movie, so the director and Tom Hanks, and I've forgotten the name of the director as well, and to CERN to visit, and there was a web page was set up explaining what's portrayed in Angels and Demons and what the reality is. So there was a very active and proactive engagement with the people involved in the film, with the author as well. Not to correct, not to get them to change what was in the film, but to really then through communication make this link. This is fiction, this is reality. So that's an example of a case that CERN was involved in. Sorry.
I'd be inclined to say, I know that you're chairing a session, maybe you remember as well, that you're chairing a session later on that's got about misinformation. But I'd be inclined to say, beware of becoming too preoccupied with this, because you could spend your whole life correcting things and doing nothing else. And then if you are obsessed with that, then you're actually obsessed with the weaknesses of the publics, and their vulnerabilities and their gullibility and their susceptibility and so on, and you forget that actually they've got interesting things to contribute. So I think it's not a passing phase. We've had misinformation and disinformation since ever. Since the popes ran Europe. Whatever time you like, but it's just more visible and accessible on a minute-to-minute basis. But as I say, precisely because of that, you just have to just choose your targets, choose your battles. And what I'm struck by, both in Gian-Andri's story about getting a small army of professors to retweet a tweet against the financial cuts, or dealing with the neutrino story, or dealing with the Dan Brown story, is don't be afraid of either things having gone wrong, or don't be afraid of controversies. And actually controversies can help swell the audience massively. And then you've got to just have your arguments well marshaled, well organized, and persuasive. But if there'd be reasons for never getting out of bed if you got obsessed with misinformation and disinformation, because it seems a hopeless possible case,
Yeah, I would agree that sort of fake news is a new name for an age-old phenomenon, and it just sort of manifests itself in different ways. And but it's always been there. It's always been a thing. And I agree that it could also it could be a huge time sink if you became overly preoccupied by it. And actually, what's really important is to get great information out there that people can access, rather than sort of getting into sort of constant battles on social media and so on. And I think sort of what often goes hand in hand with this preoccupation about fake news is a claim that trust in experts is falling to the floor. You know, nobody trusts anybody anymore. And actually, there's good research that shows that levels of trust in scientists, other academic experts and so on is as high now as it has been in previous decades, that it hasn't sort of fallen off the cliff. You know, trust in journalists, trust in estate agents is low, but it's always been low. Trust in academics and scientists and so on is high. And I think that one thing that we think about a lot, sense about science, is what we would describe as sort of flashpoints in people's lives. That might be, you know, a moment of health crisis, or, you know, a sort of particular event in your family where you absolutely have to get to the bottom of an issue that's of great concern to you, whether that's something like breast screening, or, you know, a whole range of other things, allergies that your child might have, asthma, whatever. And you will absolutely, in that moment, be motivated to get to the bottom of it and find the good evidence and make a decision off the back of that. So it's really crucial that we don't allow, that we aren't like rabbits in headlights, that we don't allow a vacuum to unfold, and that we get that information out there so that people, when they're ready for it, can find it.
So I'm Neil Maiden from the Cass Business School in London. And I have a question about social media and duty of care. So yes, there are lots of scientists and there are lots of politicians on Twitter, but there are lots of other kinds of people as well. And we're living in a society that's becoming increasingly fragmented. So in the United Kingdom now, we have numerous politicians that are subjected via Twitter and other means to death threats every day. And it's not just politicians, civil servants who have spoken up against some of the more extreme views have received death threats. A doctor who contradicted one of our leading politicians about the stockpiling of body bags for Brexit has received unpleasant messages. So I'm not saying that scientists are necessarily in the front line now, but there's clearly a move towards that more direct confrontation and the belief you can intimidate people down. I wouldn't not stop saying something, but I would certainly want to know that my institution would provide the kinds of support and protections that would be needed. So I'm just curious how you think about how you will deal with social media and support for scientists in a world that is likely to get more difficult for that kind, some forms of communication of that kind.
Yeah, that's why I install also this monitoring stuff and these webinars. They and when they have a sort of shitstorms or long discussions, we follow them and we help them. We call them, we invite them to our office, look what's going on, etc., what you could do. As I said, I think they're doing quite well. They're doing very well because they are trained also to discuss. They are scientists. They have a lot of discussions going on in their field. So I'm really surprised how good they are. Maybe they are underestimated often. And yes, we try to help them, of course. And I don't see it's too dangerous for them out there on Twitter because it's also. There are not very many people on Twitter. We know them. There are some bots, of course, and there are some freaks, etc. But you can ignore them, and it's not too dangerous, in my opinion. I mean, it depends also on the country. We are a three-language country, so it's cut in. We have only 8 million people, and cut in 3 language regions. So it's really a small world in Switzerland, and. Up to now it works. I think when it will go crazy, then maybe once we will say you should go to another tool. But the training now and this contact to the persons who are communicating are very important for us, and they are really good and good ambassadors, and they are then well trained also to communicate. It's a new tool, and they should do it. So I see, like, I agree with Brian. We should not be too afraid now. We should go for it, learn, and yeah, when it comes to a shitstorm, then we take it.
I have a very quick one that is maybe one of those dumb questions. Starting from what Dr. Fiondella told before about the researchers in his particular example should come to this, training should come to this activity. But in some cases, how? Because I'm working in the knowledge transfer office of Ca' Foscari, that is quite a recent one, and the communication manager is even more recent figure. And among some very critical points that I've found also with some colleagues that are, for example, the frustration, the let them go issue, and so on, I found also some difficulties in convincing some, above all some professors, for example, some senior ones or advanced ones, because they're those who maybe think they already know how. Obviously, I know how to talk to firms. Obviously, I know what my research is of. And it is a very delicate point. I've been told many times, oh, no, you cannot tell to this professor that he does not really or she does not really know how to talk about this or how to approach a firm, for example. Are there some good practices?
I mean, the times where I have been able to convince some of the senior staff is either if I could make an argument where their research happens to be in the news or will be in the news. For example, we have a few researchers who study the impacts of climate on the Amazon. And so every year there's a predictable time where we have to worry about wildfires spreading in the Amazon. And one researcher in particular is doing some amazing work, but just not the most outgoing in terms of being willing to answer reporters' questions, always just kind of fielding them back to me, and then I've got to find somebody else. And so I would do like more sort of one-on-one interventions where I say, look, you know, this work is really important. There's opportunities here for us to be in the news, right, and increase the visibility of our research. Give it a try, you know. And the problem is that, you know, unless it comes from the highest level, so if my director will say, I encourage all of the groups to go, especially some of the group project leads, it's very difficult to have very busy people take time to go. And it, you know, I wish there was an easy solution. Sometimes competition is good. You know, I work with very competitive people, and you know, making the point that so-and-so is talking about the work that you do, but they're not really, you know, as qualified as you, and you know, working all sorts of trying to be as convincing and manipulative as possible, preying on their sense of competitiveness. But really, this is a fundamental issue, right? It's the issue, you know, with these workshops. Again, is there's too few and far between. And they're not, to a scientist, I think there's lack of sort of empirical evidence that it's worth their while. I mean, there's people that are going to do it because they're inclined to do it, senior, junior, whatever, and those are great, and we just sort of encourage them and we support them in any way. There are other people that shouldn't do it, and we try to just say, okay, that's fine, let me do it for you, you know, and but then there's others that I think could do it, but don't get that support, don't get the motivation. And, you know, and I deal with researchers. I don't even deal with faculty who are, all, you know, supremely independent, and no one's going to tell them what to do ever, right? And so it's a big issue, and if it doesn't come in some, there's no incentive to do it, or if they're not motivated or incentivized in some way, either either through prestige or through, you know, support that they might get for their group or lab or a prize or something, that I really don't have a clear answer. Maybe somebody else might.
You better be aware your fan club is filming. The part of the answer would be to let them go. The ones that don't want to and are simply not going to be persuaded, just okay, let them go. But you do need. I mean, I think Francesco's point about needing role models and champions is well taken. And yeah, but if you just get one out of 20 of the senior scientists to come with you as a champion, as it were, a kind of an internal ambassador, to use Gian-Andri's phrase, that might work. But hopefully, if all of these efforts are worth anything that we've been doing over all of these decades, then there ought to be a generational change happening, a cultural change happening. Otherwise, we've been wasting our time. And the people that were junior 20 years ago are now intermediate and maybe even senior, and maybe have come with different expectations and different attitudes and so on. So it should, in principle, be getting easier to find those champions. But maybe 1 out of 20 would be a good enough percentage to work with.
There was a question here.
It's for Francesco Fiondella. Actually, you work in an American university, and I was wondering if there are differences between how science communication is done in the USA and how it's done in Europe, and if you think that, or what do you think the Europeans should take from the Americans and the other way around? Because there are cultural differences. I mean, Europeans are very implicit, and Americans are very explicit. I mean, straight to the point. So all these things matter. Would you give a feedback on this?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm struck as somebody who tries to communicate science. So there's this sort of press release model, right? That's, I think, going to be different in general, just among the sort of American and European approach, and also within the European countries, there's differences. And I don't know if I know enough about how it works here to talk about the sort of interaction with journalists. But the public engagement in science sort of outreach and communication, I'm struck by how more at ease and comfortable I see science, art, and sort of sharing and even forcing communities like science and art, or science in museums, to come together. And I find where my efforts back home and the efforts of the colleagues who are interested in this, it's very sort of one-off. You have to find funding for it. I mean, perhaps Venice is just a sort of anomaly, right? I mean, it's just so historically the sort of meshing of science and art communities has gone on forever. But I would like to see more, us be more inspired and bring to the States the cultural exchanges that happen between especially for me, it's fascinating to put one group of people inside the space of another. So the example that I can talk to is a few years back, the International Center of Photography showed this exhibition of Sebastião Salgado, who was a very famous photographer, black and white photographer. And he had this major exhibit at the ICP down in Lower Manhattan. And he insisted that as part of the exhibition, he wanted to educate the public on the frailty of our planet. So we connected, my institution and the Earth Institute more broadly, connected with ICP and put together all of these programming, again, not at our house, but in their house. And so where we had our scientists come and lead the public around on a gallery tour and sort of find ways to interact or intersect, how their research intersected with, say, the Salgado's photos in West Africa, you know, where they're not photography experts, and they're not even experts in the topic of the photos, but they are experts in, say, the climate of the Sahel. And so it was wonderful to get these clashing of cultures inside this house that scientists never enter, and to also see how the photographers, right, and the photography community reacted to that sort of visitation of this sort of foreign culture. So I think that happens more easily here, certainly in Italy, from what I've noticed, but also just from what my co-panelists in discussions yesterday I learned, is that there's just this kind of default mode where, of course, you're going to have artists in residence, and of course, you're going to bring in musicians and the like, and that's not default back home. And I think it's important because there are cultural barriers that to be broken, not just the educational science literacy barriers.
Is there any other question from the audience?
Can I just say about the American-European issue, and I did say earlier on today that the American way of doing things very often does translate over after some sort of time lag. Actually, the American field of science communication studies is very much more preoccupied with misinformation and disinformation for reasons that you can well understand, given the current presidency, given the arguments about climate change and so on, than is the case in Europe. And they have, some people in the States have developed something they call the science of science communication, which is really attractive sounding, but is a very limited, largely social, psychological perspective on communication, focusing on the reception of messages rather than the production of messages or the context of messages. But just to use a very crude engineering understanding of communication. So personally, I'm very cautious about that approach, but it is one of the cultural differences. And I know that wasn't quite what you were necessarily asking about, but in science communication studies can also affect then how science communication practice is managed, is programmed, and so on. So it's just something to be aware of. Science of science communication sounds like a really good banner to have, but it's one fraught with problems and potential misunderstandings.
I know that Gian-Andri has to make an announcement before closing this morning.
Yeah, I would like to invite you to the next UPRIO conference, because next year it's in Trieste, at Chiara's home in Sisa, and it will be from the 30th of August until 2nd of September. It's always interesting to have this inputs from all countries of Europe. We learn a lot, and you learn a lot how it goes in other countries, so it's very inspiring and a very good, friendly atmosphere. So I hope to see you there.
And before that, in sunny Scotland, at the end of May next year, is the PCST conference, to which all of you are eligible and welcome, because it is the only international conference dedicated to science communication that addresses researchers, educators, trainers, practitioners of all types, and you're also very welcome. And you only have 10 days left to put in